I wanted to just give you guys an update on some things we've been talking about. Those of you that have been here before know that we record these sessions and we are posting them on our website. We just finally got the okay that the videos from the last few sessions are online. Unfortunately, my colleague Bill Clace's computer had a little crash landing last week and he hasn't been able to update the website yet. So I want to share with you where on the internet those are actually found, and rather than going to our webcast website, you can go to this website instead to see those videos. Those of you that are new, if you want to stay on at the very end, I will actually show you the website for the webinars itself. But in the meantime, those of you that want to catch up on past sessions, either you missed them or you wanted to review them, if you go to YouTube, and then the web address is youtube.com/user/UW co-op extension, and the website's right here in the browser window for you to see. And I'm going to scroll down here, and if you go to the bottom, you see the lists. It says environmental and natural resources, and if you click on that, you will see on the side here there's the Learn About Your Land Assistance, Learn About Your Land Success Takes Planning, Learn About Your Land Tax Issues, and then the Learn About Your Land Managing Your Woods for Wildlife. So if you wanted to view any of those until we can get the actual webinar website updated, that's the easiest place to find those sessions for now. As usual, we have some poll questions for you, so let me launch the ones at the beginning. Let's see, here you go. Those of you that have not been on these before, we do some quick polls at the beginning and then a few polls at the very end. If you want to respond to the poll, you just click on the circle next to the response that you prefer. I see that 64% of you have voted, so there's a few more left to vote, so we'll give you a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close this one and launch the next one. So we're asking about timber harvest in the last 5 years. A few more seconds for you to get your vote in. All right, I'm actually going to share the results of this one mainly so that our speaker can see the results. So the majority, 83% of you, have not conducted a timber harvest in the last 5 years. Two more before we get going. This one is in reference to any future timber harvests. Have you talked to a forester, a logger, or a timber company about a future timber harvest? Couple more seconds. Still waiting for a couple more people to vote. All right, and actually I'm going to share this one with Tom as well. Actually, I'll share it with you all. Again, the majority of you have not discussed a future timber harvest. And the final is our usual technology question for you all that you should be familiar with now. So have you used the internet to learn about conducting a timber harvest in the past? All right, and it looks like 92% of you said no. So today we're going to be talking obviously about timber harvest, and our speaker is Tom Steele, who is a superintendent at Kemp Natural Resources Station with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I will let Tom give you a little bit more background. So let me unmute Tom and let him take over as presenter. So just give us a minute here.
Good afternoon, everyone. And Chris, am I good to go?
You sound good, and everything looks good on this end.
Perfect. Thank you. And good afternoon again. As Chris mentioned, my name is Tom Steele. I'm superintendent of the Kemp Natural Resources Station, which is part of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. UW has a variety of research stations scattered across the state. I happen to work at the one that focuses on natural resources, so I'm located way up in northern Wisconsin. A little bit about my background. I'm a forester by training and studied forestry at University of New Brunswick in eastern Canada, and then did graduate work at UW-Madison. What I'd like to do today is talk to you about timber harvesting. And for you as landowners, a timber harvest is probably the most important tool that you have in your toolbox. Now, when a timber harvest is done with care and with planning, you can configure the harvest in such a way that it meets your objectives, whether those objectives be recreation or wildlife or aesthetics or timber revenue. However, if you don't exercise care and you don't plan your harvest carefully, what will happen? Your objectives won't be met, and second, you risk doing environmental damage. So what I'm going to do over my presentation here is cover 7 steps to a successful timber harvest. Now, this isn't exactly a cookbook, and the reason why is that, well, each timber harvest is different. The products that are being removed are different, the location, the soils. There's just too much variability to have a cookbook. But what I do want to do is provide you with some guidelines. So you can think of this presentation here as some rules of thumb, some things to keep in mind as you move forward to conduct a successful timber harvest. Now, what do I mean by successful? What is a successful timber harvest? 2 criteria. The first, it's a harvest that meets your objectives. Doesn't matter if your objectives pertain primarily to wildlife or cutting some firewood or aesthetics or putting in a new hiking trail. So first ingredient to successful harvest, meets your objectives, and second, it's a harvest that maintains the ecological integrity of your land. Now, as I go through my presentation here, you're going to hear some terminologies, perhaps some new phrases, new terms, and I'm going to define those as I go along. But if I slip over one, or if there's a term that you just don't quite understand, I encourage you to email or text Chris, and she'll let me know, and we'll go over what the definition is. So with that, let's get started. Now, this gentleman, do you recognize this gentleman? This is Aldo Leopold. And Aldo Leopold is the father of wildlife conservation in North America. In fact, he founded the first wildlife ecology department in the whole country, and that happened to be at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. What did Leopold have to say about timber harvesting? Well, he wrote, "I have read many definitions of what is a conservationist and written more than a few myself. And the best one is written not with a pen, but with an axe." Leopold realized that harvesting is a tool. It's through timber harvest that we manipulate the structure, the composition, and the development of our woodlands. In fact, Leopold was the first individual who really put timber harvest within a broader ecological context. He was the one who gave us the ecological basis for timber harvesting. Now, many people, when they think of a timber harvest, the image they have in mind goes back to like the late 1800s or early 1900s. Here where I'm at in northern Wisconsin, that was the big logging area when really the state was clear-cut from east to west. That is not today's timber harvest. Today's timber harvest are completely different. But unfortunately, people have, in many cases, the perception that, that's what timber harvests look like. And it's simply not true. It's simply not the case. Today's timber harvests are designed to do a number of things. And the first is that they regenerate forest. Again, think of timber harvest as being a tool. And one of the things that we can use this tool to do is remove our old trees to give room for new trees to come in and grow. The second thing that timber harvests do is that they create plant communities. In fact, researchers are working now looking at different ways that we can create forests that are missing on the landscape. Now, this is going to sound almost contradictory, but we have a research project going on now that's looking at novel ways of harvesting trees to accelerate the development of old-growth forest. Other studies have looked at using timber harvest for restoring pine barrens or for managing aspen forests. So again, we use our timber harvest to create desired plant communities. And in the process, what we're doing is we're modifying wildlife habitat. By cutting some trees and by leaving others behind, we change the wildlife habitat. We manipulate it. And in the process, we make our environments more hospitable, more friendly, more preferable to some wildlife species and less preferable, less desirable to others. Increasingly, and particularly out west, timber harvest is prescribed to control wildfire. Out west, we've had a very successful program of controlling wildfire, and that has led to the accumulation of fuels. Now there's a program in place to go through to try to reduce that amount of fuel that we have on the landscape. In different parts of the world, particularly in the mountainous regions of Europe, timber harvests are used to regulate water flow. They're used to manage watersheds and control water supply to various communities. And lastly, today's timber harvests definitely consider aesthetics. We realize that we're having an impact on the landscape. And what we want to do when we implement our timber harvest is have the least aesthetically negative impact as possible. All right, sticking again with successful harvest. And again, a successful harvest is one that meets your objective and is ecologically sustainable. So, in order to be successful, we have to consider a few things, particularly on the ecological sustainability aspect. And the first is the terrain. What is the terrain of your property? Is it flat and level, or is it rolling? That's the type of consideration that we need to include when we look at our timber harvest. Are there streams that run through your property, or lowlands or wetlands that need to be examined and have special attention paid to them? The next thing is, what is the soil on your property? Is it a sandy soil that could tolerate logging essentially year-round? Or is it perhaps a fine-textured soil, a lowland soil that really should only have logging occur in the wintertime when it is frozen. What are the characteristics of your timber? Are we talking about pulpwood products? Essentially, pulpwood are small diameter trees that are mashed up and converted into paper and paper products. The other alternative, saw logs. These are large diameter trees that are sawn up and made into boards and 2x4s. So the characteristics of your timber will influence what kind of harvest, what kind of timber harvest you will have, and what kind of equipment will be used. Also, what is the weather and the climate? In our region in northern Wisconsin, where we have lots of snow this year and good frost, that factors in to allow us to harvest some lowland sites that otherwise might not be possible. Perhaps your woodland is in southern Wisconsin. Perhaps there are some issues with climate where, oh, we don't want to do any logging in the springtime because our soils might be too wet and we don't want to risk doing any soil damage. And again, I want to stress this over, a successful harvest considers your objectives. Not just your timber objectives, but what are your overall objectives for your property? What is it rather, that you wish to accomplish with your land? Now, there are 6 phases of a timber harvest. The first phase, planning. That's when you as the woodland owner would meet with a forester and or a logger to discuss your timber harvest. Exactly what is going to be done and where and when and how. Then we have the actual operational aspect of the timber harvest. It starts with felling, where the trees are removed or severed at the stump. The next phase is processing, where those trees are then processed into various products, whether they be pulpwood or fuel wood or saw timber. And this process involves removing the branches and the top. The next phase is primary transport. We now have these products on the forest floor, and we have to get them to an area called a landing. You can think of the landing like an accumulation yard, where the products are stored so that they can then be loaded onto trucks and then ultimately trucked to the mill. The final phase being secondary transport. Now, you as a landowner, you can be involved in all 6 phases. And there are some landowners who are really keen, like to do their own felling. They enjoy their weekend lumberjacks. They like to be out there. It's in part, I can think of my dad as a good example. For him, it's part of his therapy. He really enjoys working in the woods. But for the majority of landowners, their involvement is primarily in that first stage, that planning stage. I should mention, if you think you have an interest in getting involved in all aspects or some of these aspects of a logging operation, first, it's hard work, difficult, it can take some specialized equipment, and it's potentially dangerous. So you need to have that in mind before you jump in. I guess have your eyes open before you jump in and want to become a weekend lumberjack. All right, what are our steps that we're going to follow when as we proceed with our timber harvest? Well, the first thing that you need to do is realize that the logger who's going to harvest your property is unfamiliar with your property. So the first thing, you want to get them oriented, not only to your land, but also to your objectives. So before you can share what your landowner what your objectives are with the landowner, with the logger, you need to realize yourself, all right, what is it that I wish to obtain from my property? Am I interested in some wildlife habitat? Am I interested in, oh, maybe I'm just interested in some revenue here. My son or daughter's getting ready to head off to college, and boy, this would be nice to be able to have some revenue to apply to their college bill. So first, know your objectives. You can think of that old Alice in Wonderland quote that goes, if you don't know where you're going, then any road will take you there. Well, the same thing is true about being a woodland owner. Know where you want to go, and then share that knowledge, share your objectives with the logger and with the forester. The second thing you need to do is have a plan. We recommend that you have a management plan. You can think of the management plan for your woodland as the map. It describes where you are now and where you want to go, and the intervening step of how you're going to get there. The next thing you need to do is mark the boundaries of your property. Again, the logger won't be familiar with your land, doesn't know where that one corner stake is, or doesn't know where there might be perhaps a low wet area. So you want to make sure that your property lines are well marked. And our forests, we manage our forests on what's called a stand basis, where a stand is an individual grouping of trees that are similar and characteristic. We'll want to have our stands marked out as well. You would also want to designate perhaps any special areas, any personal areas that are important to you. Maybe you've got a favorite deer stand. You want to make sure that that's designated. Or maybe you have a bench where you'd like to just go sit and overlook a lake or a pond. You want to make sure that those areas are known to the loggers as well. The next thing you need to do is designate trees. Designate which trees are to be cut and which trees are to be left behind. Now, how can you do that? Well, you could do like this gentleman is showing. You can mark individual trees. Often what foresters will do is that they'll put a spray of orange paint or red paint on a tree, and they'll do so right about eye height and again at the stump, and that lets the logger know, okay, this is a particular tree that needs to be cut. You could also go through and rather than mark every tree, you could designate which species need to be removed. Let's say you have a mixed wood forest and it contains, let's say a little bit of oak and a little bit of maple and some white birch. And the white birch are all getting mature. Well, rather than going through and marking every one of those white birch trees, your plan could say, all right, it's time to go in and harvest all white birch. Or likewise, sometimes the plan might say, we need to go in and harvest an entire stand. A good example of this would be a tree species like aspen. Aspen is a pioneer species that likes full sunlight, and if the management objective, if the goal is to recreate a new, young, thrifty, and thriving aspen stand, well, we might designate that stand by saying, okay, cut all the trees within this particular boundary. Step 2, appraise the value. Now, when it comes to selling anything, it makes sense to know exactly what is the value that you're selling. You need to know what it is and what it is worth. So with timber, what we're talking about is we need to know the species. In this particular case, are we selling oak logs? Or are we selling jet pine? Are we selling aspen? So we need to know the species, and the second thing we need to know are the products. Earlier I mentioned we're typically looking at two different classes of forest products. Saw logs, again these are big diameter trees that are made into lumber, and pulpwood. These are typically smaller diameter trees or trees that either have some characteristics, whether it be rot or maybe some crook or large branches that prevent them from being made into saw timber, being made into saw logs. So what you will want to do is know how much volume do I have by species and by product. So how much red oak saw timber do I have? How much sugar maple pulpwood do I have? How much white pine pulpwood do I have? So you could think of it as kind of like an inventory, kind of like, like an inventory that you have that describes volumes by product and by species. So that's the quantity part. Starting off with that. What do we exactly have for sale? The next step then is, what is it worth? You have to gauge prices. You have to try to get an idea of, okay, what does a cord of pulpwood, what is that worth? Or what is 1,000 board feet of oak saw timber worth? Now, I'm using some units here, cords. Cord is a measure of pulpwood volume, and it's a pile that measures 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet. Think of it as a pile of wood, like a pile that you would have of firewood, but the pieces are a little bit longer. 4 by 4 by 8, that is a cord. The other term I used, board foot. What is a board foot? A board foot is a board, like you can think of just like a regular milled board, that is 12 inches wide, 12 inches long, and 1 inch thick. So we use cords to measure pulpwood volume. We use board feet to measure sawlog volume. So you want to gauge prices by cord, by board feet for your various different for the various products that you have. Now, where can you get these prices? Well, you can speak with neighbors. Perhaps you know someone down the road who recently had a timber sale, and you could ask them, hey, you know, how did you make out with your timber sale? Would you mind sharing with me the prices that you were looking at for your different products? Another good place is to visit with your local DNR forester, because these foresters administer a lot of timber sales, and they have a good idea what wood is selling for at a particular point in time. Now, the thing that you need to realize, though, is that you need to adjust these prices for your site. Just because your neighbor got $45 a cord for their jack pine doesn't mean that you're going to get it. There could be a number of factors that might influence what the difference between what they got and what you will receive. And it might have to do with timing and changes in markets. It might have to do with the configuration of your land versus their land. So, a good thing, go out, just do a canvas, do a poll, see what people, what other landowners have received for their wood, but then realize that, you might not get that. You might get more, you might get less. You need to adjust these values for your site. Now, I just wanted to go on a little diversion here because prices are often a very popular topic among woodland owners. And this chart here shows the average Wisconsin pulpwood stumpage prices by species over time. And what do I mean by stumpage? Stumpage is the value of the trees as they stand on the stump. Not the value of logs or the value of pulpwood, but what do these trees sell for standing on the stump? On the left-hand side, you see dollars per cord. Again, pulpwood sells by the cord. And across the base, you will see the years. And what this chart shows is really 2 or 3 things. First, that prices vary over time. You can see that 2005 was really a good year for stumpage prices. So if you were talking with a landowner, maybe your neighbor said, hey, yeah, I sold my aspen and I got $45 a cord. Well, perhaps they sold it in 2005. 2 years later, on average, that price has dropped by over $20 a cord, down on average now to be about $25. So that's the first thing to realize. Prices vary over time. The second thing is that there's great variation by species. The different lines on the graph show the prices for stumpage by species. So we've got aspen, jack pine, red pine, and miscellaneous hardwood. So if someone said, yeah, I ended up getting, $45 a cord here for my wood, and you're only getting maybe 25, perhaps the difference has to do with differences in species. Now the next chart shows the same thing, but now we're talking about saw timber and saw timber prices. And again, on the left-hand side of the screen, now what we're looking at is dollars per foot. Or excuse me, MBF is 1,000 board feet. And in this case, same rules apply. Prices typically vary over time, and they vary by species. So a board foot is not necessarily a board foot. A board foot that you have for sale is not necessarily the same one that your neighbor might have for sale. Okay, enough of my tangent there. Let's get back to step 3. The next step then is to locate the roads, trails, and landings on your forest property. Now your roads, trails, and landings, they're the transportation network that provides the logger access to your timber. You can think of these roads, trails, and landings as the link from the stump, from the forest floor, to the mill. Now from the logger's perspective, the fastest route is the best route. But that might not be consistent with your goals, with the goals that you have for your property. So again, when you think of roads, trails, and landings, you need to consider what are your overall goals for the property. And perhaps your goals are, well, you know, I would really like to go cross-country skiing and have some cross-country ski trails made through this area of my property, you know, maybe off to the northwest. If that's the case, you could ask the logger to use that particular area for one of their trails. Or let's say you're interested in creating a wildlife opening. A wildlife opening on your property could be created by a landing. And what is a landing? Again, a landing is an accumulation yard. It's a spot, a small little opening in the forest where the wood is collected before it is delivered or shipped to the mill. So when you lay out your roads, trails, and landings, or locate your roads, trails, and landings, you want to work with the forester and the logger so that these roads, trails, and landings are integrated into your overall goals for your property. The next thing you need to do is then fit your RTL, your roads, trails, and landings, to the characteristics of your property. You want to consider the topography. Are we going to try to negotiate or go around this really hilly area? Similarly, you want to consider the soils. Sandy soils are able to withstand more traffic, so if you have an area that might be a low area that has some fine textured soils, you'd like to avoid those. Are there any streams or wetlands on your property? That will influence where you put your roads, trails, and landings. Also, what is the shape of your property? Does it have an irregular shape? Is it long and narrow? Is it just almost perfectly square like a 40? That could have an impact. And last, what's the equipment that's going to be used in the season? The logging equipment that's done to harvest the trees on your property is really quite variable. It could be big, it could be small, and that equipment will dictate what size roads you might need, whether or not you'll need big landings or little landings. Also, it could have an impact as well on what time of year or what season your logging is going to be done. As a rule of thumb, we say locate the landings first. And you can think of landings, again, these are like the nerve center of a forestry operation. There's a lot of things happening at a landing. Again, a landing is an accumulation yard. So you want to decide those first, the location of those landings. And last is BMPs. What are BMPs? BMPs are something called best management practices for water quality. And what they do is, again, another set of rules or thumbs specific to roads, trails, and landings. And they cover really the things that you need to consider when fitting your roads, trails, and landings to the unique characteristics of your property. The fourth step, you need to go out and solicit some bids and select a winner. And you have to do that by getting a logger list. You can think of this step really as kind of advertising and marketing. You need to let your loggers know, or let the loggers know that, hey, you've got some wood for sale. And the first thing is getting a logger list. And you can get a logger list from your local DNR office, or you can go on the web, and at the end I'll have a web address for you. The Wisconsin Professional Loggers Association, or the Great Lake Timber Professionals Association, provides a directory of all loggers who work in a particular area. So you want to get a list, identify who are your potential clients. And then you're going to send out a prospectus. What is a prospectus? Well, it's a detailed advertisement, and it describes what species you have for sale, what's the volume by product. So I'm going to be selling 25 cords of jack pine pulpwood, and I'm going to be selling 3,000 board feet of white pine sawlogs. The prospectus also describes the acreage, What is the size of the property on which the harvest is going to occur? Where is it located? What part of the state? The sale type. And what the sale type refers to is whether or not this is going to be a lump sum sale. That means the logger is just going to pay one price to harvest all the trees designated in your management plan, or whether they're going to pay by product. So they might submit a bid that says, all right, I'll pay you $25 a cord for your jack pine and $120 a thousand for your white pine. If they quote a price by volume, that's called a scale sale. And your prospectus should also include a bid bond, reference to a bid bond. You can think of this as a performance bond. The bid bond is like earnest money that ensures that the person who submits their bid is genuinely interested in harvesting your timber. Once you've collected all your bids, you'll want to review them and check for references. You will want to go through and not necessarily select the highest bidder. You want to just do some investigation, and let's say you might want to look at the top 3 or the top 5 bidders, get some references from them, and see, what kind of job have they done on other sales. And lastly, you want to select a professional. You want to choose a logger that you think really provides the best fit with your land and your land ownership objectives. The one thing that I will say is that from my perspective, the skill and professionalism of the logger is just as important as the amount of money that you're going to receive from the sale of your timber. All right, next step. Step 5 is prepare the contract. And the contract is a legally binding document. It clearly describes the business relationship between the seller and the buyer, and it's used to minimize the potential for misunderstanding. Really what the contract does is it outlines who, what, where, when, and how a timber sale will occur. So it's going to include things like name and address, your property location, the time period for which the logging is to occur, the type of sale. Is it going to be a lump sum sale or a scaled sale? If it's a scaled sale, what's going to be the price per product? And what's going to be the schedule for payments? It'll also describe the species and volume, some utilization and operational considerations, and by utilization it might say, okay, in this particular sale, all the tops remain the property of the landowner, because perhaps you as a landowner, you want to use those tops for your own firewood. Some other things that it might include, or we recommend that include, is a performance bond. A performance bond is money that the logger puts up that is put into escrow. And what it does is that it's kind of like a reserve fund that can be used if there happens to be any property damage to your woodland. Your contract may also describe what equipment is going to be used, where the roads, trails, and landings are. Perhaps there might be some slash requirements. Slash are the branches and tops that are left behind on the forest floor after harvest. And a common slash requirement is that, all right, we want all slash to be less than, let's say 18 inches tall. Now, I want you to realize that you can write a really, really stringent contract. And you could be doing so to protect all of your objectives. But you need to realize that a more stringent contract may result in fewer bidders and lower bids. The contrast is that you may have a very unrestricted contract, a real loose contract. That looseness will provide you with less control. So you want to find a balance where, again, you're most comfortable. Some landowners actually go through and they get the help of an attorney to help them review and develop their contract. The Wisconsin Woodland Owners Association and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources have sample contracts on their websites, and it's a great place to start when developing your own timber sale contract. And again, you can see a web address there for a sample contract that was prepared for the Wisconsin woodland owners. All right, you've gone through, you've done your inventory, you've identified what you have for sale, you've gone out and marked the trees, designated exactly what it is on the forest floor, you've solicited bids, you've selected your logger, and now the sale is going to be started. What's the next step? Step 6 is monitoring the sale. Having a signed contract isn't enough. You need to monitor the sale to ensure that the terms of the contract are being met. Now, it's quite possible that the logger who ended up purchasing your sale, well, that might be different than the person who's actually operating the piece of harvesting equipment. So you want to make sure that the whole logging crew that's working on your property are aware of the terms of the contract. So that generally involves making frequent visits to the site. What are some things that you want to look for? Well, you want to make sure that just the marked trees or the marked stands are being harvested. You want to make sure what's getting cut is what's supposed to be cut. Next, you want to make sure that there is little residual damage. What do I mean by residual damage? This is damage to surrounding trees that are to remain on the site. You want to keep that damage as low as possible. And with today's loggers and today's logging equipment, they can do some phenomenal work. Essentially, in some cases, it looks like they just tiptoed through the forest to harvest the trees, and none of the trees that remain can get scuffed. So you want to be on site looking for the potential for residual damage. You'll also want to be on site to look for any site damage. What are some examples of site damage? Well, are the conditions a little bit wet? Is there some rutting that's occurring? Or do we have a little bit of erosion going along this one trail? Those would be some things that you'd want to keep your eye open for. You want to make sure that the utilization standards are being met. So if the logger is supposed to leave the tops behind, make sure that that's indeed happening. Likewise, your contract might say, all right, the logger is supposed to take out every stick down to what's called a 4-inch top. So do you want to make sure that the logger takes out all the product that's available there? That might be a term in your contract. Well, you want to make sure that that utilization standard is indeed being enforced. And lastly, you just want to ensure compliance with all the different terms of your contract. Now, one thing you need to do, though, is be reasonable. You need to be fair and flexible, because that contract was designed, at your desk or at your kitchen table, not on the forest floor. And most likely the logger is going to run into a situation that isn't really covered in the terms of your contract. And I'll give you a quick example. Let's say you have 2 trees side by side. One of them is designated to be harvested and the other one isn't. Let's say the tree on the left is designated to be harvested. Well, it could be that that tree on the left, the logger can't access it with their piece of equipment. Maybe there's a rock nearby, or there's just some configuration of the land that prevents the logger from harvesting that tree. But without doing any ecological damage or damage to the site, the logger could decide, I'm going to leave the tree on the left and instead harvest the tree on the right. That's being fair and flexible, giving the logger the opportunity to do that where the situation warrants. All right, our final step then in our timber sale is to complete the administration. You need to retire the site. Now, your site, your woodland, could be prone to some erosion during and immediately after logging. A practice that's often done, in fact, sometimes it's even written into logging contracts, is they ask the logger to seed all the trails and all the landings that they use. So what might that mean? Well, they might sow some clover or some other plants on the trails, on the landings, to help protect those areas from erosion. So after your sale wraps up, you want to retire the site. Make sure that it's all returned to being productive forest. You want to make sure to take steps to promote regeneration of your forest. Maybe the next step is to come in and do some tree planting. Or maybe there's some advanced regeneration, some trees already growing on the site that you want to go in and encourage their subsequent development. You'll also want to release the logger and complete any paperwork. Now, what do I mean by release the logger? Untie the logger? Well, yeah, you want to untie them in a legal context or in a legal setting. Remember, that logger put up a performance bond. You want to, if the logger did everything A-OK, you want to return that performance bond to him or to her. And lastly, you want to complete any paperwork. You need to record what was sold and how much did it sell for. You're going to need this information when you submit something called a cutting report. That's required whenever you harvest timber. Also, you will need this information when it comes time to submit your income tax. Now, throughout this whole process, you as a woodland owner have some responsibilities. The logger has some responsibilities, and those are carefully outlined in the terms of the contract, but I want you to realize that you have responsibilities as well. What are your responsibilities? Well, they are, you need to have realistic goals for your property. You want to make sure that your boundary lines are nicely and properly marked out. You want to make sure that the timber that you're selling, that you actually have ownership of that timber. And you can see from the list different things that you need to be responsible for. Having a plan, selecting the best bid, having a written contract, going through your responsibility to provide access to the logger. Also, I want to just stress the last 4 items. First, to be flexible with your timing in case that, let's say the logger runs into a stretch of bad weather or their equipment breaks down. Realize that you might have to grant the logger some additional time. You also need to realize that some damage may occur on your property. Most often this damage is small. It does not impact the ecological integrity of the land. But you need to be prepared and you need to be reasonable as you move forward with your timber harvest. And last, you need to be a good steward. Now, when I talk with landowners about having a timber harvest, I get to hear some terrific stories. And many times people like to say, oh gosh, I had a harvest and oh, everything went wrong. Oh, it was just the worst thing that ever happened to me. And based on my experience, my observation, unsuccessful harvests fail for one of 5 reasons. First, it's because they failed because the landowner didn't have a management plan. They had no idea where they were going or what they wanted to accomplish. And without a plan, well, it goes back to that Alice in Wonderland quote. Really, any road will take you there. So, unsuccessful harvests fail often because they don't have a plan or the landowner doesn't have an inventory. They weren't aware of what they were selling. They didn't know the species. They didn't know the products. Timber harvests will often fail if the landowner does not go out and solicit bids. Studies have shown that the more bids a landowner gets, the higher the price they receive. Generally, the ratio between the highest bid and the lowest bid is 3 to 1. So we really encourage you to go out and solicit bids. Harvests fail because there is no contract. And again, the contract is this legally binding agreement between you as the landowner and the logger. And last, harvests fail because there is no oversight. You can have the best plan in the world, top-notch inventory, you go out, solicit all the bids, have a wonderful contract, but if you aren't there to oversee the timber harvest, well, some things might fall through the cracks. So, what do we recommend? Don't do items 1 through 5. Instead, what we recommend is that you work through the 7 steps that I described here today. A colleague of ours, a gentleman named Mark Rittenbach, has put together a wonderful publication called Conducting a Successful Timber Sale. And it nicely describes each one of these steps. Lastly, I'm going to make a few more recommendations. First, we really encourage you to work with a professional forester. A professional forester has the expertise and the knowledge to see your timber harvest from beginning to end, to help ensure that your objectives get met while protecting that ecological integrity of your land. The second thing that we recommend is that you work with a professional logger. In Wisconsin, there's an association called the Great Lakes Timber Professionals, and this is a group of professional loggers who adhere to a strict code of conduct. In fact, there's even a more stringent code of conduct called the Master Loggers. And we recommend that you work with a professional logger when having your timber sale done. Where can you find these individuals? Well, you can do a search. Go to the website, www.wpla.org, and you can find a list of professional loggers and also master loggers who work in your particular area. So, by following these 7 steps, working with a professional forester and working with a professional logger, you could ensure that your timber harvest is a successful one. Now, Chris, any questions?
In which you can type your questions, and they will come to me and I'll share them with Tom. Tom, is there a way for you to turn your speaker down a little bit so that you don't hear me, or we're not getting feedback?
Yes.
Okay. Just a little bit. There we go. Can you still hear me?
Better?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions, now is the time to ask those questions in the question pod and send them to me. I do have one here, Tom, and just to give people a heads up, in the meantime, I will be putting some polls forward if you could answer those polls while Tom is answering your questions. So Tom, the question I have here says, there used to be a timber marketing bulletin published each month by the DNR possibly. Is that still around?
No. What had happened was the DNR used to provide, and if this is the information that I think the individual is referring to, the DNR used to publish on an annual basis regional timber prices by product and species. And what they found was that the information that they presented was calculated in a complicated way. It was a 3-year weighted moving average. And what they found was that landowners were looking at this information and they would see a price reported by the DNR, and it wasn't the most accurate price that was currently prevailing in the market. So they have stopped producing that, and instead now what they do is that they recommend that the landowners speak with DNR foresters and visit with their neighbors or other individuals with whom they know who have had a timber sale recently. So again, if this is the information that I think the individual is referring to, it is not published any longer.
All right. The next question is, what happens to the stumps? Are they just left standing?
An excellent question. I mentioned about utilization guidelines. A common utilization guideline is one that all stumps need to be below a certain height. And those stumps typically are left on site just to decay. And depending on the species, if it's a species like white birch, they may decay just in a matter of years. If it's an old oak stump, or in some cases a white pine stump, they may be around for decades.
Great, thank you. Just as a reminder, we have a poll up. If those of you that have not voted could please vote now, that would be appreciated. A couple more questions for you, Tom. The next one is from a former Leopold student, so lucky. And he asks, what if you don't want to get money for your harvest, but you just want to improve the aesthetic and wildlife habitat?
An excellent question. It is the value of the trees that allow, how will I phrase this? It's the market value of the trees that allow you to go through and attract a logger to come in to achieve your management objectives. Now, if you have trees that do not have a market value, then what's going to happen is you're going to have to pay to get that treatment done out of your pocket. You can think of it as really the forest in the case of a merchantable forest, the forest is paying for its own management. So what would be a good example? Oh, let's say we've got a red pine stand that's very thick and the trees are all crowded. To go in and thin that forest, to open it up to give the remaining trees more room to grow, the cost that it would take to do that is really realized in the harvest of the products from that red pine forest or that red pine stand. Now, if you're faced with the predicament where your forest or a particular stand doesn't have any commercial value, that doesn't preclude you from going in and getting the work done, but you need to realize that you're going to have to pay for it. The forest doesn't have the value to pay for it itself. It's something that you will have to find another source of funds to get that work done.
Great, thank you. A couple more. Someone asked, how long should you plan on from start to finish for developing a timber harvest plan? And I guess I would add to that, how long can you usually expect before a logger says they will start and they actually can start?
Okay, two good questions. It will really depend on where your property is, and if you're working with a professional forester, a consulting forester, let's say, what is his or her workload and whether or not they can come out and visit your property right away. Some consulting foresters have they're really good and they've got a big backlog. They might be behind maybe 6 months or more. Other foresters can be just as good, but perhaps they're new in an area, or just the way that their workload is such, they might be able to come out next week and see your property. The development of a timber harvesting plan, how long it takes really depends on how complex your property is, how big it is. It's not unreasonable to have a plan take as long as, perhaps a month to develop to maybe as long as 4 or 5 months, once again depending on the complexity. Regarding the timber harvest, usually what is done is that the harvest window is identified in the contract, and you might say, all right, we want the harvest to only occur during frozen ground conditions, and that would be in Wisconsin anytime from perhaps December through until maybe the early part of March. And what you might do is give the logger perhaps a year or 2-year window. So you might say, all right, you can start on December 1st of 2009 and continue through until, let's say, March 15th, 2010. And your contract could include the possibility for an extension. However, that extension could, it would give the logger the opportunity, essentially another season, to come in and harvest your property, but it has to be for a good reason. Perhaps we had a spring thaw, or excuse me, a winter thaw that prevented the logger from operating on the site. So to answer your question, you can think about maybe anywhere from a month to perhaps as long as 6 months to get your management plan and timber harvest plan developed. And then sales can take anywhere from just a matter of months to perhaps as long as 2 or 3 years to complete, particularly if they're only being conducted during frozen ground conditions or a particular season.
Thank you. I have 3 more questions here. This one says, is it customary to sell both pulp and saw timber, or to have a harvest where only one or the other is taken?
Outstanding question. Yes, most timber harvests involve multiple products. So they involve both saw logs and pulpwood, and often involve multiple species.